Hello everyone, good afternoon. I hope you all are well and we are meeting here again to talk about two chapters which we left. I had left two chapters to complete, and you had started second paper. The two chapters that I left to teach you, one was the party system in India or political party in India. Secondly, I left second social movement. Social movement. So we didn't discuss this two topic, and we had conversation that we will do it later on. So today we will focus on the second chapter, social movement, and then I'll take the first chapter, that is party system. Now, I don't know how many of you know that. What do you know about social movement? No, each social movement strives to social and political change. Any social movement, be it Me Too movement, you must have heard about Me Too movement, right? Me Too movement. It was a movement, right? For example, if you look at, there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, and there's a peace movement, right, in Europe basically, and all over the world. And there are organizations around the globe which wants peace, not the war, and they are doing movement, on different level. There are, human rights movement. You must have heard about human rights movement. Human rights movement. You must have heard about civil liberty movement. Right? Then you must have heard about Dalit movement. Dalit movements. Must have heard about farmers movement. Now all movements, all this, whatever the movements we talked about, all social movements strives to, they seeks to change basically. And what are the change? Some social change and political change. And there are, various social movements around the globe. Now, if you look at in India there are Dalit movement, feminist movement, human rights movement, right? Me Too movement, farmers movement, labor union movement, You can see there are student movement, right? There are many. And if you look at, any social movements has five essential components. Any social movement. First is, objective goal, right? Some movement has another goal. So first is objective, right? So what is the objective? For example, when the parliament passed farmers law, there was a goal to change it, right? There was a goal decided by certain organization and leaders that government has to withdraw it because this farmers law was not in favor of the farmers basically. So any social movement has some goal, some objective. Any social movement. Secondly, if you look at any social movement has its own ideology. On ideology. Now, in the in the post 2000, if you look at, we are living in a post ideology world. For example, if you talk about corruption against India against corruption, there was no ideology. But if you talk about another movement like farmers movement or Dalit movement or civil liberty movement, it has their ideology. Right, so ideology is also another essential component of any social movement. Right, then each social movement has certain program. Each social movement has certain program or agenda. Right, each social movement has certain program or agenda. Right, and each social movement has leadership. कोई ना कोई लीडर होगा हर सोशल मूवमेंट में. Without leader, no social movement can move. Right, and then fifth is organization. Right, organization is very important for any social movement. For example, there was the India against corruption, so there was a India against corruption organization. Right, so any social movement has this all essential component. Now, if you talk about what are the social movement that we need to study, we need to study civil liberty and human rights movement in India, women rights movement in India, and environmental movements in India. So if you look at that we need to study, right, first we need to study three kinds of social movements. First is civil liberties and human rights movement in India. Civil liberty and human rights movement in India. Secondly, we need to study about women movements in India. Women movements in India. And thirdly, we need to talk about environmental movements in India. So there are three primarily movement that we need to study. Apart from it, you can you have to be aware about any movements if occurs, right? So let me talk about the civil rights movement in India, right? Civil rights and human rights movement in India. Right, before I go to the civil rights and human rights movement in India, the first we need to talk about social movement and new social movement. थोड़ा ये बता देता हूँ, उसके बाद then we'll move to civil liberty movement and human rights movement in India. First, let me make distinction between social movement and new social movement. Social movement and ये से new social movement. Now, if you look at social movement seeks to change the structure of the society. For example, anti-caste movement in India, That was a social movement, right? For example, there was a labor movement in India. That was social movement, right? For example, a farmers movement in India. That was social movement. Farmers movement is a social movement because it seeks to change the particular structure, right, of that society. And social movement is also located in a particular geographical location. For example, Dalit movement can be found only in India, not in Europe, right? Because there is no Dalit in Europe, right? So social movement can be located in a particular geographical area, right? For example, uh, labor movement, that labor movement in India, right? Labor movement in France, labor movement in other country, that is social movement. Fine. So if you look at caste movement, civil rights movement, workers movement, peasants movement, farmers movement, right? They are located within a particular, state, within a particular, and they want to seek to influence political parties. The social movements are located in a geographical area and it seeks to influence the political parties, right? Right. And it is a very much old one. बहुत पहले के जितने भी मूवमेंट होते थे उसको सब सोशल मूवमेंट के अंदर आते थे. Basically, this is a very much old one, right? So first, the social movement is all old movement, all old movements that were located in a polity of particular state. मतलब इंडिया में कोई मूवमेंट हो रहा है तो वो सोशल मूवमेंट पाएगा. जैसे फार्मर्स मूवमेंट था, वो केवल लोकेटेड था इंडिया में एंड दैट वुड बी कॉल्ड एज अ सोशल मूवमेंट. Social movement always wants to influence political parties. I'm writing SN, seeks to influence political parties, right? And they also want certain reforms. Certain reforms to law, right? Like Forest Right Act or forest movement, right? In India, land right movement in India, that was located in India. Land right movement is like tribal movement is a social movement. Now, what is new social movement? Now, if you look at the new social movement has initiated in 1970s and 80s, right? And they are not located in a particular polity of state. They are universal in nature. For example, you can look at environmental movement. Environmental movement is not located in a particular state only. Environmental movement is spread around the globe. It is universal in nature. You can find environmental movement in India also. You can find environmental movement in US also. You can find environmental movement in European countries also. Right? So, NSM, I'm writing New Social Movement, NSM emerged in 1970s and 80s, 1980s, and it has universal appeal. Throughout the globe. ये पूरे दुनिया में आपको न्यू सोशल मूवमेंट मिल जाएंगे, राइट। फॉर एग्जाम्पल आप देख सकते हैं इन्वायरमेंटल मूवमेंट और फेमिनिस्ट मूवमेंट, राइट। सो ये है फेमिनिस्ट मूवमेंट। अब दूसरा है कि ये पॉलिटिकल पार्टी को इन्फ्लुएंस नहीं करना चाहते। इफ यू लुक एट न्यू सोशल मूवमेंट, they don't want to see, seek to, they don't want to influence political party, no, they seek to change the lifestyle of the people. The NSM seeks to change the lifestyle of the people. ये लाइफ स्टाइल, लोगों के लाइफ स्टाइल, फॉर एग्जाम्पल इन्वायरमेंटल मूवमेंट, इन्वायरमेंटल मूवमेंट appeals to the people to, okay, behave in such a way that they can protect environment, right? Or like feminist movement wants to change the lifestyle of the people to behave in a particular way, right? Now if you look at the third difference between social movement and new social movement, now if you look, the objective of social movement is to reduce, right? If you look at the objective of social movement is to increase some financial gain. For example, आप देखेंगे ट्राइबल मूवमेंट, तो ट्राइबल मूवमेंट क्या है कि लैंड चाहिए मुझे, राइट। फॉर एग्जांपल दलित मूवमेंट वाज फॉर टू गेट रिजर्वेशन, राइट। So you can see that social movement has some economic angle, right? Social movement may influence that there may be economic gain that particular community may get, right? But if you look at the NSM does not want economic gain, but yes, NSM wants cultural gain, right? Cultural, which is universal in nature. For example, NSM, new social movement, wants to change the lifestyle of the people, lifestyle of individual, right? It wants to change the value, culture. It does not want to, it is not interested in the economy, right? For example, Me Too movement, the purpose of the Me Too movement was to bring certain things, right? And also it sought to change the behavior of individual, belief of the individual, that don't exploit women at workplace. So if you look at new social movement, may seek economic gain, economic gains. But if you look at here, the NSM, new social movement, may seek change in value, attitude, and belief. ये इस सब में चेंज कराने के लिए कहता है कि भैया अपने एटीट्यूड में अंतर लाइए, अपने वैल्यू में अंतर लाइए, अपने बिलीफ सिस्टम में अंतर लाइए, राइट। If I give you example of the social movement and new social movement, if I talk about SM, right? So if you look at, for example, Black Panther movement in India, Black Panther movement in US, it was a social movement. For example, Dalit movement, you must have heard about Dalit Panther movement. Dalit Panther movement. You must have heard about tribal movement. Right? You must have heard labor movement. Labor movement. Now that is the example. You must have Swadeshi movement. If you look at, the freedom struggle movement, freedom movement in India, that was a social movement. Freedom movement in India, right? You must have heard about other backward class movement. Other backward class movement. You must have heard about accountability or religious movement. Right? Ayodhya movement. Right? So if you look at this, all movement has located in a particular area. Right? They seeks to change the behavior of the political party, to bring some law. Right? But if you look at new social movement, if you look at new social movement, then new social movement, there are various examples of new social movement. For first example is environmental movement. Environmental movement does not seek to influence political party. It does, but not necessarily. Right? It actually it does it wants to change in the behavior of individual, their value, their attitude. We should behave, you know, in a very sensitive manner towards our ecology. Right? For example, feminist movement. And you can find this movement universal anywhere, human rights movement. You can look at this movement, you can find in anywhere of the world. In India also, in the West also, in South Africa also, right? In America also, right? Like for example, LGBTQ movement. You can find anywhere in the world, right? Me Too movement. Me Too movement. So there are difference between the social movement and new social movement. Now come to the talking about civil liberties movement and human rights movement in India. Right? Let me talk about civil liberties and human rights movement in India. Civil liberty movement and human rights movement in India. Let me talk about this. Now, if you look at, entire Indian national movement, if you look at entire Indian national movement, was a civil liberty movement, right? Civil liberty movements, a certain kinds of freedom to live a civilized life. That is civil liberty movement. If you look at you know, if you look at Indian national movement, and then if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was a human rights movement. But during during colonial time, Indian national movement was a largest civil liberty movement in India. And then when after independence, you can see the civil liberty movement, you know, after the emergency, basically. Right? It was after emergency. Right. So if you look at during British time, during colonial era, Indian national movement was largest civil liberty movement in India. It was the largest civil liberty movement in India. There was a multiple leader. There was a many organization, Indian National Congress, right? But not only Indian National Congress. There was a organization established by Ambedkar. There was an organization established by other people leaders who fought against British government, right, for the civil liberty. Fine. If you look at the civil liberty movement and human rights movement at the global level, that has initiated after just World War II. And if you look at UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was passed by UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, to on August 10, 1948. Fine. Now in India, if you look at after independence, this was the independent before independence. If you look at the post independence, if you look at post independence, after emergency, if you look at even the during emergency, people were protesting against the government, right? The government imposed censorship. Now, even post-independence, first civil liberty movement was, if you have heard about Telangana government, Telangana movement, Tebhaga movement. Telangana movement was in AP, Andhra Pradesh. Basically, the agricultural laborers started movement, right? And they wanted, land. The slogan of Telangana movement was, land belongs to the tiller, right? So those who are tilling the land belongs to them. And if you look at Tebhaga movement was in Bengal. Again, it was a agricultural movement started by agricultural laborers, right? And they demanded right to land, basically, right? So this was the first episode of the civil liberty movement in post-independent India. Second, civil liberty movement in India, you can see that in the post-emergency period. That is, movement, after emergency. If you look at emergency of 1975, that emergency has, posed a serious question, right? Serious question. If you look at government actually initiate, started arresting people, right, and putting, putting in jail without trial. There was a detention, huge detention. Government imposed, uh, government imposed, censorship on media, right? Government trespassed the private individual liberty, right? And without legal sanction, government was taping telephone, restricting people liberty, right? And during the national emergency, you can see there was a national family program, right? So there was a, national family program, and under this national family program, there was a sterilization of young people, right? What happened after this state, atrocities that was done to people, right? Now, if you look at many organizations emerged, many organizations after the emergency, and few, organization that was, their name was Citizen for Democracy. Then there was a People's Union for Civil Liberty. Then there was a, People's Union for Civil Liberties and Democratic Rights. And there was one organization name was Chhatra Yuva Sangharsh Samiti. Basically, today you can see that Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, that was also organization. That was organization. This organization was launched, to fight with the state, right, and protect the civil liberty, right. And if you look at this organization was at forefront to save the civil liberty and human rights in India, right. If you talk about the several states, there are, dozens of, there are number of organizations that evolved in different city of India and in different state of India to protect the civil liberty, right? And in due course of time, you can say that movement was enriched by several, or movement in 1980s or 1990s. You can see that there was a Dalit tribal movement, there was a Dalit movement, there was a movement for LGBT rights. Then there's a movement for right to information. There is a movement for food, movement for education, movement, a number of civil liberty movement that initiated in 1990, right? So if you look at, the civil liberty movement that has strengthened in 1980s and 1990s, right? There is a one scholar, his name is Ajay Gudavarti. He's a well-known scholar of social movement. And if you look at his, he divided civil liberty and human rights movement in three phases in India. If I talk about, the civil liberties and human rights movement, then we can define that in three phases. First is called civil liberties phase. Civil liberty and human rights in India. तो फर्स्ट फेज है, का नाम है सिविल लिबर्टी फेज. और इसको हम कब से मान सकते हैं? इसको मानते हैं इमरजेंसी के पीरियड के बाद से लेकर के 1980 तक, राइट. सो इफ यू लुक एट, this phase initiated just after in the post emergency. If you look at in the post emergency period, there are hundreds of organizations that evolved to protect the civil liberty in India. there are hundreds of organizations evolved to protect civil liberty in India. अच्छा ये हुआ क्यों? ये हुआ because state did atrocities. A state, Indian state basically you know uh, curbed curbed the liberty of the individual, right? It was in response to emergency and brutality during emergency. ये जो इमरजेंसी के दौरान जो ब्रुटैलिटी हुई ना, उसी के कारण ये राइट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, राइट 100 ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इन्वॉल्व, राइट. देखिए few organizations like Citizen for Democracy, People's Union of Liberty, People's Union for Civil Liberty, ठीक है, then People's Union for Civil Liberty and Democratic Rights, Democratic Rights, right, and so on and so on, not organized against state. And they actually basically they published newsletters, they published journals, right? They in Hindi as well as in English languages, right? To difference between democracy and dictatorship. Indira Gandhi was projected as a dictator, right? And there were many scholars in universities, then there are journalists in media, there are lawyers, political parties who started campaigning against autocratic state, right? So if you look at, this was the first phase in of civil liberty and human rights in India. Second phase that was started in 1980s and no 1990s, right? It is called, you can so called democratic right phase. First was civil liberty, then democratic rights. Now civil liberty expanded, right? There are new social groups that evolved, new political parties that evolved, right? And they started protesting against, state, and especially the Congress party, because Congress party was very dominant during those times, right? And these new groups like PUDR, People's Union for Democratic Rights, become very active to protect the rights of the people, vulnerable people especially, right? And meanwhile, if you look at during this time, the Supreme Court allowed PIL, public interest litigation, right, to protect the rights of the people, right? Supreme Court emerged as a guardian and protector of the citizen rights through the PIL, right? So if you look at during this phase from 1980s and 90s, you can say 90s, 80s and 90s, right? There are many various groups, and Supreme Court also become very powerful. Now, if you look at third phase, that is, human rights phase. Now, since 1990, if you look at 1990 till now, you can say that has categorized as a human rights phase. Now, if you look at human rights movement was embraced by various kinds of movement, like tribal movement, like women's movement, right to education movement, right to information movement, right? Then also right to food movement, right? And the people have also started, right for rights for freedom. For example, there's a movement against Tada, Tada, POTA, UAPA, right? The protest against a special economic zone. And if you look at this movement, that movement was enlarged due to two reasons. Because first was state was rolling back, right? Rolling back means state was withdrawing from the welfare, and people were becoming vulnerable. Second, if you look at from since 1990, UNGA, United Nations General Assembly, passed several, international agreement, right, to protect the human rights around the globe, right? And if you look at, today, if you look at human right protection is a grave concern in India, right? There are violation of rights, right? And this is not, you can see the, international report where there are, which says that there, human rights violation in India has increased in recent decades, right? There are 27,000 civil society organizations which, whose certificate has been rejected or not renewed by the government. So there are multiple problems. There are, so that is human rights and civil liberty and human rights movement in India, right? I'll stop here today. Tomorrow we'll talk about, women movement in India.